My name is Colin Ellard, and I get lost. I get lost a lot. I get lost in the woods. I get lost in cities. I get lost in buildings. But it's okay. I know that I'm not alone. I know that you get lost too. We miss appointments. We're late for dates. We miss flights. It's almost, it seems, a universal of the human condition. So, what is that all about? Why do we get lost? I've been described as somebody who said that human beings are the only species who are capable of getting lost. But I think anybody who's ever seen a lost dog or knows about animal shelters or has heard stories of migratory birds being blown off course knows that that can't be literally true. But what I think is true is that we human beings share a unique and very interesting relationship with space. We have a very interesting mental connection with space. And not only is it interesting, but I think it's of fundamental importance to the way we work, the way that we live, and especially how we build and plan. And what I'd like to do is to tell you a bit about my personal journey of discovery relating to my understanding and my interest and my passion for that mental connection between place and space. It's kind of a long story. I spent a lot of years studying very fundamental problems in animal behavior. I was interested in how animals use their mental representations of space to solve some really simple problems, like finding food, avoiding predation, and finding shelter. In fact, for some time, I was actually the world's leading authority in how the Mongolian gerbil computes the distance between one rock and another rock. I may still be that. I'm not sure if the title has ever been challenged. I would be the last person to downplay the importance of asking very simple and small questions in science and looking for those small answers, because I think incrementally that's how science grows. And I'm proud of the work that I did. But I came to a point in my career where I wanted something different. I wanted to see if I could confront some of the bigger questions. How to find the bigger questions? I wasn't sure. I did what I think any self-respecting scientist would do when confronted with a big question like that. I ran away. And here's where I ran. I took advantage of a sabbatical in 2005 to do something a little bit unorthodox. Rather than to go to another university or another lab, talk to new people, learn some new techniques, I moved to a tiny dot of a lobster fishing village on the east coast of Canada, Lehave, Nova Scotia, to spend a year there basically trying to find myself. And having landed there, I wasn't really exactly sure what I wanted to do or what I should do next. But the poet Wallace Stevens said, "The truth often lies in a walk around the lake." And I thought, well, I have the ocean. The ocean's a pretty big lake. I'll start to walk, and I'll see what happens. And not very far into my year away, I came across this on the beach one day. And what this is a series of trails made by a number of tiny sea snails. And if you look at these trails, it looks as though the sea snails were lost. But they're not actually lost. What they're doing is they're responding, they're completely local. They're responding to local conditions. They're responding to small instabilities in the surface, of the substrate, of the sand. They're responding to gradients of temperature, of water, of moisture, of smell. Every turn in that sea snail's course is guided by these kinds of local events. And then I looked over my shoulder and I saw this. This is me. These are my footsteps walking down the beach. There's clearly some concession to the local here. There are some big boulders that I didn't crash into. There's a sea that I didn't walk into, at least not that day. But it looks as though there's something very different going on here. It looks as though there's definitely an element of my having walked from point A to point B. It looks as though I'm going somewhere. And maybe I was. But for me, what was really the most interesting part about my comparison of those snail tracks and my own footprints was that I could look back over that track and I knew how little of my time was actually spent with my mind in the same place as my feet. I could almost trace step by step what was going through my mind as I walked this path along the beach. And it was nothing to do with the beach. I was thinking about Inuit wayfinding. I was thinking about Australia. I was thinking about the cookies in my kitchen. My mind was leaping effortlessly from place to place and from time to time as my feet were making this path along the beach. And to me, that was really the first epiphany, this idea that when we construct mental representations of large-scale space, as human beings, what we're doing is we're putting together these really interesting amalgams of perception and imagination. We're combining what we see with what we're thinking about. We're combining what we see with those mental leaps through space. For large-scale space, it turns out that we're not really very good geometers. We may mentally conceive of the distance from A to B as being different to the distance from B to A. And anybody who's had to drive somewhere they didn't want to drive and then drive back understands exactly what I mean. We straighten curves, we change angles, we chunk together large regions of space that may not necessarily belong together. And all of that is reflected in how we represent large-scale space. And I think that it's one of the reasons why, from time to time, we lose our way. We have a hard time wayfinding. Now, there's something else that happened to me in my year away as well, and that was that over the course of time, I found that as I was working through the ideas that I wanted to put together, I was very literally walking through those ideas as well. And what I mean by that was that as time went by, I was beginning to put together a narrative that was glued to the landscape that I was in. It was as if I was throwing this kind of invisible quilt of my thoughts and ideas over the beaches, the forests that I walked through, the old trails, the back roads, and it began to feel to me as though there was a risk that if I ever left La Have, Nova Scotia, I would lose all of the progress that I'd made. There was some sense that what I'd done was to build a space that knit together all of my ideas. And so I began to fear the loss of these epiphanies that I was having. I'm not sure what you'd call the loss of an epiphany, maybe an apocalypse. So I began to fear the coming apocalypse. Maybe I could never leave. Maybe I could never go back to my lab and answer any of these big questions. What I was actually doing, and I didn't really realize this at the time, was that I was tapping into really an ancient, thousands of years old tradition that relates to our tremendous facility with narrative. What I was doing was learning the landscape and also learning about myself by using a prepotent ability that human beings have to make up stories. If you ever watch a child, and we should do this as much as possible, watch children in natural environments, and it's reflexive. They can't help but to spin fantasies and invent stories that connect where they are and what they're doing with what they're seeing in their environment. And this is something that, as I said, has been used for thousands of years, at least by traditional wayfinders like the Inuit, who invent stories, devise an entire culture, kind of a spatial culture that not only binds them to the landscape, but also can serve as explicit wayfinding aids. So that was really my second kind of epiphany, that while we may not be very good geometers, but in some respects what we do to substitute for some of our weaknesses in wayfinding is that we tap into things that we are really strong with, and one of those is narrative. Now, there's something else that I thought about in my time away as well, and that was this, that we have done something amazing. We have conquered light speed communication. We can use electrons, we can use radio waves, we can communicate instantaneously across broad reaches of space, both on the planet and beyond the planet. And that, of course, is fantastic, and it's one of the facilities that we're all here to talk about today and to think about how to use that ability to cross broad reaches of space and make those kinds of connections. And we can build social networks. We can not only think about what's happening somewhere else, but we can actually see, we can sense it more or less directly. So it's wonderful. But if you think about how to combine that with a mind that maybe is not built for doing good geometry, at least over large-scale space, then I thought maybe there was a little bit of a risk here that what might happen is that we would tend to diminish the importance of real distance and real place in our lives. If the combination of the way that our minds are put together and long-distance instantaneous communication, telecommunication, work together, they can generate for us the illusion that physical distance doesn't matter, that we are essentially everywhere. And the fear is that if you're everywhere, you're actually nowhere. So if this is really true, then what it ought to mean is that for the purposes of my human experience, it doesn't matter whether I'm sitting in the parking lot in my car at a box store mall or whether I'm somewhere like this, sitting underneath the trunk of a 600-year-old hemlock tree in a beautiful old-growth forest. And my thought was that this just can't be. It can't be that place doesn't matter, and I'm going to risk the apocalypse, and I'm going to come back to my lab at Waterloo and have a tender talk with my Mongolian gerbils and tell them that it's time for us to part ways. It's time for us to move on. I want to do something different. I want to understand how place affects human experience. So how do you do that? There's kind of an ironic twist here. The set of methods that I landed on was to use the methods of virtual reality. And so virtual reality is no longer really rocket science. You've seen some pictures of virtual reality already today, and I'm sure that you've heard at least the basics about how VR works. This kind of VR employs a helmet. The helmet has screens that lie in front of the eyes, 2 screens, so you get a 3D view. There's some lovely motion tracking, which means, and that's really the wonder of this, is that as you move around in space, what you see on the screens is updated to produce a powerful illusion that you are somewhere other than where you really are. So the ironic twist here is that VR works so well because we have these minds that are quite prepared, adapted to deal with these kinds of wild and woolly changes from one space to another. So when you put on a helmet, it's not as if you actually forget where you really are, but in very many respects, you behave as though you have. You behave and feel as though you're somewhere other than where you really are. You behave and feel as though you're part of the simulation that I present to you. So the agenda in my lab has been to begin to look at how where you are and what you experience and what you see influences your behavior at a micro level and influences your feelings. And what I mean by that is that while you're wearing the helmet, we can measure your movements, we can see where you go, we can measure your eye movements. When you blink, we can measure your stress levels, your heart rates, and we're moving towards being able to measure things like blood pressure and brain waves as well. So we can build up this very, very detailed portrait of how where you are and what you're seeing is influencing your thoughts and your feelings. I'll just tell you very briefly about one of the projects that we've been working on, which deals with domestic spaces. So the idea here is to ask questions about how your home space, where you live, might influence your thoughts and feelings. And so we devised some models, some simulations of home spaces realized in real dimensions, so they looked and felt as big as the real houses. We made 3 of them. One of them was a typical North American suburban house of the kind that you'd find almost anywhere. Our house was modeled on a house that actually exists in Milton. We also had a couple of designer homes, one designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and one designed by Sarah Suzanka, the still working American architect. And we invited participants to come to the lab, don the helmet, and explore our houses while we carried out all of our measures. And what you're seeing now on the slide is just a video run through. This is actually what one participant in the experiment did in the Sarah Suzanka house. So bear in mind, you're seeing this in fairly small scale. It's not wide field. You're not seeing it in stereo. And most importantly, you're not controlling the movement. So it's a movie. It's not really very immersive compared to what participants in the study were actually seeing. But one of the most interesting results, I think, from this experiment was that when we asked participants which of our 3 houses they would be most likely to buy, to want to purchase, the majority of the participants picked the Milton house, the typical North American suburban house. But on our other measures, what we were discovering was that in terms of people's feelings of comfort and ease and how they would use these different spaces, the preferences were really quite different, suggesting that, number one, not only where you live is making a difference to your behavior, to your thoughts and feelings, but also, number two, and perhaps most importantly, suggesting that we're not always terribly well in tune with what kinds of domestic spaces might work best for us. We may not always know exactly what's good for us. The ambition here is to build towards a kind of evidence-based design that combines simulations of built spaces ranging in size from those domestic spaces like the one that I showed you to city-scale spaces, and to work towards basically an experimental design where we can very carefully measure the responses of your mind and your body to the spaces that we present to you and see what happens. See how these different kinds of spaces do affect your feelings, your thoughts, and your behavior. And I think that this is a tremendously important enterprise. One of the things I think about a lot, and I'm sure that everybody here thinks about this, is that we know that epic changes in the way that we live are coming. We know that we need to live with smaller footprints. We know that denser living styles are coming. And we also know a lot about the engineering that's going to be required to make those more dense cities. I think we know less about the psychology. We know less about how different kinds of living arrangements will affect our psychology, will affect our physiology, will affect our health. And I see this kind of method of experimental design as being one powerful tool for beginning to answer those kinds of questions. I'm not sure where the future goes, but one thing that I'm pretty sure of is that whatever we find out, one of the conclusions that will be that no matter where your mind might be, it will be very important to always remember that your feet are somewhere and your feet are on the ground, and that's important. Thank you.